Welcome to the second season of Can I Get a Retake, the podcast where education gets innovative. I'm Michelle.
And I'm Michaela. Join us each month as we dive into the trends and technologies shaping the future of higher education.
Stay curious, stay inspired, and come learn with us from today's educators.
What hidden patterns and histories underlie the social world we inhabit? Our guest today, Cynthia Heddlesten, reveals these unseen forces in her book, The Social World Unmasked. Cynthia earned her master's in sociology from the University of Missouri-Kansas City. In 2023, she started her PhD program in education for social justice at the University of San Diego in order to continue her life's work to study how people interact and what emerges from those interactions.
In The Social World Unmasked, Cynthia guides her students to question assumptions and spot the real dynamics driving our social realities. From analyzing core sociological concepts like culture, socialization, and deviance, to examining stratification across race, class, and gender lines, Cynthia equips her students to be keen observers. Her aim is to kindle a sense of wonder about the hidden forces that shape our world and society.
Well, do you want to ask the first question? Do you want me to?
Yeah, I can ask it.
Okay.
It's, right? We'd like to get the story from the beginning. We'd love you to share a little bit about your background and what led you to become interested in sociology as a science and as a career.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I get that question a lot, and it's also like the most complicated question to answer for me, which, I guess this might be true for a lot of people. But so I grew up in a very homogenous neighborhood in sort of the suburbs of Kansas City. My best friend, who's my best friend to this day, grew up 2 doors down from me, looks just like me. Most people worked at the Ford plant. Most people were Christian. Everybody was white. Everyone went to the same school. Very, very, very homogenous. And one day my mother decided that she just couldn't take it anymore, and she left my father and moved me to her hometown where she grew up. And we lived in Farmington, New Mexico, which is known as the gateway to Navajo Nation. So literally within the space of 24 hours, I went from living in the suburbs of Kansas City to being the only blonde-haired, blue-eyed white person in the middle of Navajo Nation. And I absolutely loved the experience. And it opened my eyes to the fact that not everybody looked like me. Not everybody ate the same kind of foods, used the same kind of language, celebrated the same holidays. Even the school calendar was different. So the time we went to school was different. And so we came back to Kansas City about a year later because my mom missed my brother, who had stayed with my father, and I missed my dad and my brother. But I ended up having a harder time adjusting back to living in Kansas City than I did adjusting to living in Farmington. Even though we lived in mass poverty in Farmington, everybody's poor on the reservation. There wasn't a lot of wealth. And so it was interesting because I went from this very blue collar homogenous neighborhood to sort of living below the poverty line, getting our Christmas presents from the school district, living off of like box spaghetti and hot dogs for a year, but not looking at that time in my life as anything bad. It was so eye-opening and wonderful and amazing. And when I came back, it was very hard because everybody still wanted me to be Cindy Lou Who, from The Grinch Stole Christmas. And that's what they called me. And I was so different. And I had so many questions in my mind. And I was seeing inequalities, and I was seeing how people were treated different based off certain things. And I was also very much experiencing the fact that a lot of people that looked like me didn't like the questions that I was asking. Either they didn't have the answers for them, or they just felt like I was being challenging for my age, which was only 13 at the time. So I kind of shut down, and I learned to observe and have the questions in my mind without asking them. And So when I went to college, which I was first gen, and when I went to college, my brother went to college before me, but he dropped out. And so, same thing with my cousins. So when I went to college, I started a community college, which is the community college I teach at now. And that's, I basically was going to take a class because everybody thought I wasn't going to end up being anything. And so I decided I was going to prove them wrong. And college was not something at that time in my family that was very much pushed for women in my family. It wasn't something that was considered a norm for women in my family. It wasn't something that was necessarily condemned, but it just wasn't something that was like something we did, right? It was a very evangelical growing up, and it was like very much like, you get married and you have kids and that sort of thing. So when I did take my first sociology class, I did it because there was nothing else to take. I waited till the last minute and I enrolled in sociology. I've never even heard the word before, didn't know any idea what I was signing up for. And I walked into that class completely oblivious to everything that was sociology. And I walked out knowing exactly what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And so interestingly enough, my first sociology teacher, the teacher of that class, Jessica Halpern, is now one of my best friends. We're actually family now, and we share many holidays together. We're very, very close, but you never know where life's going to take you. And so my journey into being a sociology professor started in that classroom, because I knew the moment I found out that people would pay me to ask all these interesting questions and do all this research and all these things that were bouncing around my head that society had been telling me for so long, don't ask. And people were like, oh, here's money, please ask them. I was like, okay, let's do this. And then I knew instantly that I wanted to share my passion, that I wanted to teach sociology, that no matter what I was doing in my life, in addition to that, at some way, I needed to be sharing my passion for sociology with students.
How do you feel your experiences growing up and then becoming a sociologist have influenced your research?
Research is always interesting because it evolves with us as people, right? People are not static. Society's not static. We evolve, and our research interests evolve. My research has always been interesting, focused on race and class, and that is particularly because of my experiences with my childhood. It was very difficult, and it's still kind of difficult for me to this day. The amount of poverty that we lived in when we lived in Farmington was not the amount of poverty that you see on TV. It's not the kind of poverty that you see people talk about. It's the kind of poverty that the U.S. wants to keep hidden. And so a lot of times I'll hear people talk about they're poor because they didn't get the present that they wanted for Christmas one year. And it's much different than how it was where we were at. And we were actually in a gateway town, border town. And when you get into the reservation, it was much worse. And so I became at a very young age aware. And I think it was because of such an extreme adjustment in such an extreme amount of time, right? It's in 24 hours, you go from a complete, 180. And I was, again, asking all these questions about, I didn't know the words then. I didn't know about like race and class and racism and racial formation and, all the, cultural capital, these things I didn't know about. But I was seeing them. And so then once I get into sociology and I start learning this stuff and putting these words with these, with my observations and my questions, that really paved the way for me to continue to want to go into research. And so my research, interestingly enough, has gone in 3 different directions. And now that I'm in my PhD program, it's all coming together in one perfect way. But I started off very much interested in race relations. That evolved into sort of a desire to understand social class and social class structures in the U.S. On both of those fronts, what I've always been interested in is how these dynamics in society shape us as people and shape our personalities and shape our dispositions. And so how something that society creates, like race and class, can become so much a part of how we view ourselves and the world around us and each other. And so recently, I've really become interested in the idea of language and language as a tool of inequalities, and a language as a way that these inequalities get shaped in us. And so, one of my favorite YouTube videos is by Lyra, I think it's Bordinsky or Bordatsky. She talks about, can language shape the way we think, or does language shape the way we think? And she says something very powerful in that film about how I can take an idea and through language put my idea in your head. And when you really stop to think about it, that's a very powerful thing. And so I just began to think about that in terms of race and class and power. And so all of that ties back to my experiences going from this sort of sheltered, homogenous, blinded upbringing to just having that blindfold ripped off and being like, oh, I see now. And so it all goes back to that. And so that research interest, even though it might vary in terms of language or behavior or learning processes, what's at the root of it for me always is how race and class shapes how we see ourselves and how we see one another.
When you have students coming in who maybe have had a similar upbringing where they were from that homogenous group and they learn this language of sociology, do you get to see people that were in the naive space like have that blindfold taken off of them? How does that feel for you?
I love that. In fact, I actually did some research on that. I got a grant and did some research on what I called aha moments, because I was very fascinated with the idea of, because I call those moments aha moments, when you can see on your student's face that light bulb just go off, and it's such a magical moment. And I began being very interested in if those aha moments could proliferate in the classroom through discussion, through sharing of stories. And what I found in my research was that was the case, that especially through what we call experiential knowledge or counter narratives or counter storytelling, that students were more likely to have aha moments when people were sharing their stories of their experiences. And so for me as an instructor, when I see that, it just makes everything worthwhile, and it makes it real. It reminds you of that moment for you when you were in the classroom and those aha moments happened. And I think every instructor or teacher or professor loves those moments, because when you know that you've hit it, right? You hit it for them and they've had that moment of clarity. That's a really great feeling.
In the introduction to The Social World Unmasked, your publication with us, you express a desire to make students' minds wander. Can you sort of unpack what you mean by this?
Yeah, I was at a conference and I don't remember the person I was listening to. I feel really bad that I can't cite them. But it was a long time ago. And he said that. I think he was an anthropology teacher at the University of Kansas or somewhere. But he mentioned that. He was like, we don't make students wonder anymore. There's no wonderment in our classrooms. And again, we feed off each other. He made me wonder about that. And so I really began to think about that, about how much of my life and research and desire to learn is driven by questions and wondering. And one of the things I joke around with my students is I'm fascinated with lawns and how people mow their lawns and why they mow their lawns that way, or why people dress their dogs as babies. Like, these are things, it's not a judgment. I'm just really fascinated with wanting to know that. And I think it goes back to just the fact that I am like a perpetual 2-year-old and I want to know why, and I want to know why, and I'm curious, and I love learning the roots of things. And again, having those aha moments when we can be like, oh, okay, I get why you do this, and I think too often we judge people for what they do instead of really diving in and finding out why they do that. And so that's kind of what drove this idea for me of, I want my classroom to be a space of wonder and wondering about life and wondering about these questions. One of the things I always tell my students is the great thing about sociology is the world is your playground. You can ask anything and it's almost societal related. And so when you're writing your research papers, come up with the silliest thing, the most extreme thing. Like, I've had students wonder about why birds land on wires. And, of course, then we get in the intersection of technology and the environment, which is sociological. I had a student wonder about how children use their imagination during play. I've had a student write about the fairy tale kiss in movies, and it's like, just wonder again. We live in this age of technology, of instant answer, instant gratification, AI, right? And because of that, we've stopped wondering and we've stopped asking questions because we can just get instant answers, and we forget that learning is about those connections of aha moments, of jumping from one to, of having an answer so you can ask more questions and going down those rabbit holes, and having discussions around things and theorizing, right? We look down on theory so much in our society, and really theory is such a strong, powerful thing because it's explaining why. And so for me, wondering is the same thing as theorizing, and you can put those two together. You can, and I think it was, I'm gonna, again, my people are getting all mixed up in my head here. I think it was Bell Hooks that talked about that, right? About theorizing. She was theorizing her childhood long before she realized what theory was. And it's true, that hits home. When we wonder, we're theorizing, we're explaining the world through our understanding of it. And I think that's a very powerful thing.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up? Do you have any specific strategies that you use, like in your classes, for getting your students' minds to wander?
My lack of a stereotypical academic background of growing up in the upper middle class, going to good schools, going to college, getting good grades in college, getting good grades in I almost flunked out of high school, these sort of things. Those things that I had to deal with because of my social class growing up, I feel like makes me more relatable in the classroom to students, especially where I teach. They can get that, they can understand that, and I hope and I aim for the fact that they just realize that I genuinely want to wonder about them, and I genuinely want to know what they're thinking. A lot of times I'll be like, don't tell me what Google says. Don't guess what's in my head. Tell me what you think. What's your thoughts on this? And it takes time. I have to build a culture in my classroom like anybody does. And there's usually about a couple weeks in, they start to get the feel for me and you start to see them open up. But I do a lot of active learning. And so doing a lot of discussion, even in online environments, small group, large group, do this activity, reflect on this, lots of reflection, lots of discussion, lots of interaction. The more I do that up front, make them move seats. They really hate me when I do that. Make them move seats, make them get to know each other. I'm building those comfort zones in the online environment. You don't get to keep your black screen on your little square. I have to see you. We're talking about personal, deep things, and people need to see you when you're talking about those things. And so because it's sociology, I just try to always keep it focused on the human experience that our students are going through. And they get to see me at my true self. And so I think that kind of makes them sometimes more comfortable.
And all of that was a perfect response to the question I had, which was, how does viewing the world in this lens of sociology help students navigate the complexity of life, not only in the world, but just in the workforce moving forward?
I love that question because I think unlike a lot of other disciplines, especially in college, sociology isn't necessarily recruiting for the career field. We love it if you want to major in sociology. There's not that many of us out there. We know we're not going to have like a million sociologists, right? But I think that it's kind of like math. People take college algebra not because they're going to be mathematicians or college professors that teach algebra. They do it because it gives them a different way of thinking and viewing and processing the world. And sociology does the same thing. It creates a different way of observing and processing and thinking about the world. And I think that for me, and using my I voice, sociology allows me to step back from my personal perspective and biases on things and look at something and ask myself, what's really happening here? Who is at play? What is at play? Who is not here? Who is not seen? Who is not being observed? how did this come into being? Again, that 2-year-old in me of wanting to ask questions kind of kicks in. And so I think one of the things about sociology is that really shapes the way people are able to process and understand the world. Is a little bit different than what the standard kind of response is with sociology, which is, well, it lets you get to know people in different ways. That's very true. But for me personally, what I tell my students is that sociology allows you to step back and see the world in a different way, in multiple different ways. We live in a very binary culture where you live like you're supposed to think either like this or like this, but most of us think in between. And allowing ourselves to step back and ask these questions and observe the world around us gives us a new layer of understanding of how society works, how people work, how we work in that field. And so to me, sociology is such a critical class to take because sociology teaches you to ask the questions society doesn't want you to ask. And it teaches you how to recognize and have human agency, at the same time recognizing when following social structure and order is important. And so it really helps you navigate your own human agency in society while understanding that other people are navigating their own agency as well. That makes sense.
That does make sense. How is gaining awareness of our own cultural biases so important at a societal level?
So biases are these interesting things, right? Because it's kind of like prejudice. You'll ask them if they have biases or if they're prejudiced, and like, oh no, not me, right? Because they immediately assume that if you have biases or prejudices, that like you're racist or you're classist or you're sexist. And we all have biases and preferences, right? I have a bias towards strawberry shakes, and doesn't mean I need to explain it. It's just an inclination, right? I think, though, what becomes harmful is that when you are talking about biases at the societal level, then you are talking about biases that get built into the social structure of a society. You are talking about biases that become discriminatory, that create an othering, that create institutional and systematic forms of discrimination. So a bias that I might have towards, something, a personal bias might just be a personal bias, but when my personal bias gets replicated to the point where it becomes part of society, then it's beyond just a normal bias, if I'm making sense there. And so to me, this is why sociology is really important, because if that is how systemic and structural forms of discrimination can start, then it's also how it can start to unravel. And so recognizing our own biases, our own prejudices, and recognizing how those shape and form our own forms of discrimination gives us an opportunity to see how we see that in society, to look at something and be like, that doesn't sit well with me. Something about that isn't right. I need to stop and unpack that. So to kind of circle back to your question, I think it's very important for classes like sociology, anthropology, cultural geography, all these classes that teach us that our biases come from society, but also reinforce society. Society is not some unattached entity that we're not involved with. We are part of it. We can't just blame the media for everything. We are the media. So it's an idea of recognizing that it's this interaction that has to begin to be unraveled and unpacked.
You cover collective behavior and social movements in your publication. What current movements in society do you see as driving both positive and negative social changes today?
Of course, the thing that I can think back on has been the most powerful ones lately. It's been the Black Lives Matters and Me Too movement. The interesting thing about that in the book, so I had 9 chapters. And that was not one of the chapters at first. I had 9 chapters, and the type A person in me could not stand to have a nice round. I had to have 10 chapters. It was driving me nuts. And I was like, what am I going to write about? So I had all these ideas, because, in sociology, there's so much to cover. And I was like, well, I could cover this. I need to cover that. And this was in 2000, end of 2018, right? And I'm like, I don't know that much about social movements and collective behavior. So I think I should do this because then I can do the research on it and really, really learn, which I'm so glad I did. I learned a lot. It was such a fascinating field to study in sociology. And then, of course, by the time I get done writing that chapter was the end of 2019. So 3 months before the pandemic hit, right? And all these social movements were happening. So this chapter that I wasn't even going to put in the book has become the most relevant chapter in our students' lives. And so it's so interesting that that happened that way. But I would say that my students, when I talk about social movements and which ones I really see driving behaviors, I see a lot of Black Lives Matter. I see a lot of Me Too. When I think of collective behaviors, which can go beyond just what we think of as social movements, right? They don't have to always be protests. They don't have to always be, they can be urban myths. They could be rumors. They could be mass hysteria, moral panics. We see a lot of moral panics, especially around politics these days. So I definitely see that when driving students' behaviors, and this fear of discussing politics because they're afraid they're going to trigger these sort of moral panic behaviors in people. And then I see a lot of what's interesting for me when I think about how Black Lives Matters and Me Too movements are shaping students' lives and the college students that are coming through now because they were raised in the pandemic. They know a lot of the words. They know a lot of the historical facts around these things, but they don't really understand the lived experience. They don't understand what it really truly means to people. So they'll sit there and they'll say words like institutional racism, institutional discrimination, sexism, and they have the right words, but they don't really know the heart of that. And it's this sort of interesting desensitized discussion that they'll have around it sometimes. So again, as the teacher, you kind of have to stop that and unpack that a little bit, and peel it back and help them learn how to do that.
I'm just working through that because I think I remember being that 18-year-old who knew the words, who understood the right thing to say, but because it hadn't been my background, I wasn't able to connect with it emotionally. And it took learning empathy and really honing that in to understand it to a point. But even then, there's some experiences that I can only empathize with. I can never truly understand because they're not my lived experiences.
I have a friend, I was just kind of chuckling to myself because him and I go around and around about empathy. He's a historian, and we agree and we disagree, because I'm, like you said, I think that a starting place for all of this is empathy. And I think it's from my own exact experiences, like you mentioned, is that it wasn't until I started putting myself in other people's shoes and started to see the emotional impact and the people that I loved and then the people that I admired and in their lives, that I was like, oh, okay, this goes beyond the definition of the word and me being able to work it into a paper, right? This is a lived experience. And he makes a very valid and true point, which is empathy is great, but empathy will not dismantle the structural processes that are in place. It's not going to dismantle all of that. And so we always get these really great conversations about where does it start? Like does it start with empathy so that we can then build a movement, a social movement? Because all changes that have occurred in society is based off social movements. America as an idea, as a nation, is based off of a social movement. And so do we start with the empathy to build the social movements like we saw with Black Lives Matter, like we saw with Me Too, to be able to get to dismantle? But at the same time, we're talking about things that fight power. It's a very difficult thing to do because it will come back, as we've seen with both of these movements, and shut them back down. And so we get in these interesting kind of conversations about empathy and the role of empathy in the struggle and in the battle all the time.
That's true, because there's a lot of people who can feel it and they'll change their Facebook status. Or, they'll put up a long sign, and it's like, where does the collective action begin? Where do you take that and put it into movement? I understand.
I've been doing I've been in the field of sociology for a long time now, 20 years. And it the fact that people are even doing that now is huge, because up until about so it's about 4 years ago, people weren't even doing that, and people would just be like, no, I don't see race and I don't see class, and we're all just one big happy family. And so even in that short period of time, seeing those things helped, but at the same time, I agree with you. It's kind of like, that's great that you're doing that, but are you having those conversations with your children? Are you addressing things that you see in the workplace? That sort of thing.
You've hinted a little bit at, the us versus them or in group, out group sort of tribalism that we have in society on different levels. From a sociological lens, how do you analyze that playing out with the election coming up?
It sounds really bad to say this. I really love studying in-group, out-group mentality, and observing it in myself and other people. And the media is probably one of my favorite things to do it, because again, the media is just this image, this projection of what's happening in society. And so I love watching and observing in-group and out-group mentality, and the othering of society and things like that. And so and it's a big focal point of my classes, because I do think that a lot of things come down to that. And so to get to your question about how I see it today, in the politics that we see today, one of the big ways I see this is this interesting way that political groups will make you feel at home with their beliefs, make you feel that your beliefs, because you think like them, and I'd say I'm purposely being vague, because I think all political parties do this, and I think it is a mechanism which they know that they're doing this. I think in-groups and out-groups are a tool that are politically used, where it's like, okay, you think like me, so therefore you are just and you are right and you are above the fray and you are part of the good moral fabric of America. And if you don't think like this, then you are destroying the moral fabric of America. You are wrong, you are inferior, you are stupid. And so we very much see these sort of things at play. And I find it interesting right now in terms of how age is being discussed in politics with the candidates, how this majority of this political season is basically coming down to an age group that is very similar and not that different, right? And what's old, what's not old, what are the characteristics of old, what are the characteristics of young, who talks old, who talks young, and it's very much the sort of in-group, out-group mentality. And so I find it, actually, I stopped watching the news about 3 years ago. I just couldn't take it anymore. What I do is I wait for things to kind of filter. Luckily, I work at a college, so I hear things through my coworkers, and then I go to my trusted sources and research them from there. But I'm not one of those people that get on the news every day. But when I hear certain things, I'm just like, interesting, because what I'm seeing sociologically is that these things that are happening at the national political scene are becoming projected on other scenes and other institutions within the United States, right? So I see it in workplaces where suddenly it's no longer just this disagreement we have. We create these in-groups and out-groups and these feelings of extreme dynamics almost. And I'm seeing it in schools, and I see it even in family relations and things like that. And so which came first, I don't know, but it's not my field of study, but it is something that I think because of my background as a sociologist, it's something that I can just really identify pretty quickly and see and be like, that's interesting how that's being, I mean, even fast food restaurants utilize this, right? It's a marketing gimmick even in fast food. And so it's just interesting to see how it plays out in people's lives.
A lot of your responses, I'm really curious on how sociology and psychology are so similar in many ways, because we're talking about the hidden forces. We're talking about how actions affect the way that we think. It seems like there's kind of a fine line between the two.
So whenever you're talking about history, sociology, and psychology, you are talking about three sciences that are very, my historians are going to pummel me for saying science. They very much are humanities, but three disciplines that very much intertwine, right? And connect. And in fact, I teach a class right now with three other professors, so four of us total. This class was created in sort of connection to, it came out of the pandemic. One of the historians kind of reached out to me and he was like, hey, we have the police academy here at our school. I think we need to do something about the situation that was going around George Floyd's murder, the rise of Black Lives Matter, which of course existed long before George Floyd murder, right? It started with Trayvon Martin. And so we started to craft this class that we could eventually one day put into the police academy. And then from that, we pulled in our psychology professor, which I'm going to get to your answer here in just a minute. And then we've also pulled in the director of our public safety. And so that we co-teach this social issues class that teaches our cadets and our students how to explore social issues through a historical, sociological, psychological, and public safety lens. It's a very intense class. And it is very difficult for the students in these classes sometimes to draw that line between psychology and sociology. And so Kim Glacken, who's the psychologist that I teach with in this class, we try to always kind of just explain that, because really you're talking about two sides of the same exact coin, right? And so, because we're both talking humans and human behavior and how human self and human identity. And so there's a lot of areas where we cross and we blur. There's areas where we contradict, but most of the time we do kind of complement each other. Back in the 60s and 70s, I know even when I was in grad school, you did not mention sociology to psychologists. You did not mention psychology to sociologists. It was an in-group, out-group thing, right? That's not really the way it is now. Now we're recognizing that, hey, we can complement each other and we co-teach a lot together, because she can talk about, we can sit there and talk about stratification. I can talk about how stratification looks in society, and then she can translate that into things like telomeres and how they become psychologically impacted on us. Or she can talk about fear and how fear gets created in us before we have the language to identify that fear. And I can talk about how that becomes later part of our racial implicit biases and narratives in our society. So they really do overlap and complement each other in great ways.
One follow-up I have to that is, let's say you're a student taking this course, you've had some great aha moments, you've recognized some major dysfunctions. What do you do next? You're young, you want to get out there and you want to make some change. How do you help your students usher in that change? Or what do you recommend they do to become active?
Oh, I have so many students right now that are thanking you for asking that question. They ask that question to me all the time. And it's hard, I'm learning this myself. In my program right now, we've been studying, the class I've been taking recently is the history of education through a lens of social justice and sociology, which means studying education, how, for example, formerly enslaved people started education long before the common school, or schools that were guaranteed out of the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo kind of thing, and learning about how different schools form for different racial groups in the United States, and realizing these. So, for example, we always think of Brown versus the Board of Education, right? Maybe we think of it because we're in Kansas City and Topeka's 40 minutes away, but everybody thinks about in terms of school desegregation. They think of that moment. And I was watching a documentary the other day about it's Charles Houston Hamilton or Hamilton Houston, I can't remember, who was a man that started 30, 40 years before Brown versus Board of Education, and recognized in order for a court case like that to happen, very certain little steps needed to happen. He needed to set precedent. He needed to get particular lawyers on cases working with the NAACP. He needed to have certain things in certain states occur. And very, very tiny little steps had to build over a 20, 30-year period before Brown could ever happen. And of course, they didn't know it was going to be Brown. It just happened to be the court case that happened to land at the right time, at the right place, once those steps had been taken. And so I don't know if it's the instant gratification of technology. I don't know if it's Hollywood. I don't know if it's the way that we condense these stories that last for generations into these quick little tidbits of information. But students think that change occurs through one protest. And they want to get out there and they want to make these big, impactful movements. And it's kind of like, if everybody did one little small thing, that is what adds up. And so it kind of gets back full circle to our conversation about empathy, right? Is empathy important? Yes, because if you get enough people building empathy, then you get enough people recognizing when systemic things are not right. And that's when you can begin to build and dismantle and pull away some of these things that are built into the social structure. So, when students ask me, like, what can they do? I would just go back again to wonder, ask questions, be willing to challenge. We dismiss each other by just saying, well, this is my opinion. And it's kind of like, okay, that's not the end of the conversation, right? Wonder about each other, ask questions, seek those experiences and that information, be willing to change your opinion, be willing to not change your opinion. But we got to stop shutting down the critique. We got to start shutting down the questioning. And so I guess the first thing I tell my students is continue to question, continue to seek information in whatever form is best for you.
So our final question that we like to ask everyone, it's a little segment called You're Wrong, not you, but maybe our listeners, maybe us. This is your time to set the record straight on any misconception in the field of sociology. Tell us all you're wrong about this.
Like the first thing I was like, oh my gosh, every sociologist is going to rip my head off because they're like, wrong is subjective,
Oh, yeah.
You can't tell people they're wrong about something. So I'm like, okay. But just for my personal soapbox, what I will say is you're wrong if you think that your opinion matters more than the science behind it or the information and facts behind it. Opinions are personal to us, and I get that. I get so many people that want to challenge me on my study, on what I know about society, simply because they have an opinion on it. There's a difference between doing research and studying and just having an opinion on something. Does that make your opinion not valid? Does that make your opinion completely, should I just wipe it away and not consider it? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, that I am not going to go and question my doctor's diagnosis of me because I have zero, despite WebMD and other things I can find on the internet, zero medical background, right? And so when people are talking about things that is their field of study, it is their job, their profession, be willing to recognize the fact that they're embedded in that. That is their life and that's what they see and that's what they know. And so while you have an opinion, that doesn't make it fact. And so that's kind of what I would say.
That's excellent. Yes.
That was short and sweet and to the point as well. Thank you again, Cynthia, for joining us on today's episode. In order for us to be great citizens of the world and to make societal impacts or changes, recognizing your own biases and prejudices and becoming aware of how your experiences differ from others is essential. And I think it's really interesting that both you and our previous guest, Zach Cordell, who teaches culture in healthcare, are both guiding students to develop this empathy and understanding of different cultures, economic statuses, and even religions.
Cynthia is teaching a unique generation. As she said, it's the first to really recognize the importance of mental health, especially in navigating the unforeseen forces that underpin our society. She's teaching her students to challenge, to question, to truly empathize, but above all, to wonder always about why things are the way that they are, how things came to be the way that they are, who made the decisions and choices to make things the way that they are. In any regard, this next generation is going to usher in a truly unique and diverse world and society.
Thanks for tuning in to Can I Get a Retake, a podcast by Great River Learning. If you liked the episode, show your support by subscribing, sharing, and leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. For detailed show notes and transcripts, visit greatriverlearning.com.
Can I Get a Retake is brought to you by hosts Michaela Elby and Michelle Manneman, with editing by Maggie Christensen. Artwork for the podcast is crafted by myself, and our intro music is courtesy of Comma Media. We'll be back soon with another captivating chat with a top GRL innovator.